Summer 1456. The Sultan known as the Conqueror marched with the mightiest army in the world, backed by thunderous cannons, to the gates of a shattered city. Inside those broken walls, hope was fading fast. A forgotten commander gathered a ragged group of peasants, priests, and mercenaries. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by their king. Outside, 100,000 Ottoman soldiers prepared to wipe Belgrade off the map. But when the first cannonball smashed into stone, something remarkable unfolded. The defenders refused to surrender. Faith rose against firepower, and desperation transformed into defiance. This wasn't just a siege. It was the moment when a small band of heroes stood against an empire and forever changed the path of history. To understand how impossible this victory was, you first need to know the man who came marching toward Belgrade. This was no ordinary ruler. This was Mehmed II. Just 3 years earlier, in 1453, he had done what the world thought impossible. At only 21 years old, he had captured Constantinople. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, its legendary walls turning away siege after siege. It was the heart of the old Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, and the final fortress of Christendom. Mehmed broke it. And he did so with brilliance and with a terrifying new weapon of war, massive cannons powerful enough to reduce stone walls to rubble. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves of fear through all of Europe. Mehmed was no longer just a sultan, he was Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror. His ambition knew no limits. He saw himself as the heir of the Roman Caesars, destined to build a new empire from the city he had just claimed. But to expand westward, to strike at the capitals of Europe, there was one obstacle in his way. And that obstacle was Belgrade. Belgrade, standing at the meeting point of the great Danube and Sava rivers, was far more than a city. It was a gateway. It was the key to the Kingdom of Hungary and the wide plains of Central Europe. For decades, it had been the last great Christian fortress blocking the Ottoman advance. Mehmed knew that if he wanted to conquer the West, Belgrade had to fall first. And he was prepared to throw the full weight of his empire against it. His army was a marvel of military strength for the time. Early reports exaggerated its size, but modern historians estimate it at between 60,000 and 70,000 soldiers. This was a standing army, disciplined, professional, and the most advanced of its age. At its core were the Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, taken as boys and trained from childhood to be flawless warriors, fanatically loyal, ruthlessly effective, and feared wherever they fought. Supporting them were the Sepahi cavalry and an enormous supply chain. And then there were the cannons. Mehmed brought with him an artillery train of around 300 pieces. Among them stood several colossal siege guns, the same kind that had toppled Constantinople's mighty walls. One legend even claims these cannons were cast from melted church bells taken from that conquered city. Whether true or not, the story reveals the dread Mehmed inspired across Europe. As this colossal force moved north, its target was obvious. The jaws of the empire were closing around Belgrade, and all of Europe waited, holding its breath and praying for a miracle. What they didn't know was that a miracle was exactly what was about to happen. While Mehmed marched forward with the unified strength of an empire, the Kingdom of Hungary was crumbling from within. It was a realm paralyzed by fear and endless political squabbling. The nobles argued constantly, refusing to fund a national defense. The young king was caught up in his own struggles for power, unable to unite the country against the storm that was about to strike. It seemed no one was ready, or willing, to stand in the Sultan's way. No one, that is, except for two men. Two men who could not have been more different, yet were bound together by an unshakable will to defend their world. The first was John Hunyadi. If anyone in Europe understood the danger Mehmed posed, it was him. Hunyadi was a Hungarian nobleman, a hardened warlord, and the most renowned Ottoman fighter of his time. For decades, he had battled the Turks across the Balkans, earning a reputation as a brilliant and tireless commander. He knew their tactics. He knew their strength. And he knew that Belgrade was the final line of defense. But Hunyadi faced one crushing problem: he was a general without an army. The nobles refused to provide money for a relief force, leaving Hunyadi to raise one himself. All he could gather was a corps of about 10,000 loyal mercenaries and his own knights. They were skilled veterans, but far too few to face Mehmed's legions. The second man was no soldier. He was a priest. Giovanni de Capistrano, known as John of Capistrano, was a 70-year-old Franciscan friar from Italy, originally sent by the Pope to preach against heresy. But his mission changed when he witnessed the looming threat of Mehmed's invasion. Though frail and elderly, he carried a fiery charisma that could inspire crowds. While the nobles hesitated, Capistrano turned to the common people. He traveled from village to village, a gaunt figure whose blazing sermons, delivered in Latin, even though many couldn't understand the words, ignited hearts with holy fervor. He preached a crusade not for kings and knights, but for ordinary believers. He called on peasants, farmers, blacksmiths, and students to take up whatever weapons they had and march to save Christendom. And so, the most unlikely alliance was born. On one side, John Hunyadi, the pragmatic warrior spending his fortune to assemble a small professional force. On the other, John of Capistrano, the fiery priest who believed faith alone could raise an army strong enough to challenge the greatest power on earth. Together, they became Belgrade's only hope. A hope resting on a handful of professional soldiers and a tidal wave of religious zeal. Capistrano's call to arms sparked a response no one, not even the Hungarian nobility, could have expected. From towns and villages across southern Hungary, people came. They were not soldiers. They were farmers wielding scythes and flails, blacksmiths carrying hammers, and students armed only with courage. Poorly equipped and completely untrained, they were bound together not by discipline but by faith and by the words of an old priest. They rallied under Hunyadi's banner, swelling his ranks with a massive, disorganized host of crusaders. For the professional general, this was both a blessing and a nightmare. He desperately needed the manpower, yet what he saw before him was a mob, not an army. How could peasants with farm tools withstand the disciplined charge of the Janissaries? How could their faith endure the terror of Mehmed's cannons? The tension was clear. Hunyadi and Capistrano led their followers side by side, united in purpose but divided in approach. Hunyadi and his corps of mercenaries focused on military tactics. Capistrano, meanwhile, served as the spiritual heart of the camp, leading mass and stoking the crusading fire in his followers. They lacked training in armor, but they had no shortage of conviction. They believed they were fighting a holy war. And in that belief, they found fearlessness. By early July 1456, as Mehmed's colossal army reached Belgrade, this unusual alliance was all that stood in its path. Inside the fortress, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihai Shalagi, commanded a garrison of only 5,000 to 7,000 men. Outside the walls, along the Danube, waited Hunyadi's professional soldiers and Capistrano's chaotic but massive crusader host. Together, their forces numbered between 25,000 and 30,000. Against them stood the full might of Mehmed the Conqueror. The battle began in early July. An Ottoman chronicler described the sight of their white tents stretching across the plains like a field of snow. The Danube River, the city's lifeline, was blocked by an Ottoman fleet of about 200 ships, cutting off all relief. On land, engineers dug siege trenches while Mehmed's giant cannons were dragged into place. On July 4, the bombardment began. For weeks, thunder shook the plains as enormous stone balls smashed into Belgrade's walls. These were the superweapons of the age, capable of breaking through even the strongest fortifications. Inside, defenders worked frantically at night to patch the damage with whatever they could find. But it was a losing struggle. The outer walls began to crumble, just as they had at Constantinople. The psychological toll was immense, the constant noise, the ceaseless destruction, the looming sense of doom. Hunyadi knew they couldn't simply endure. His first objective was to break the naval blockade. Without the river, there was no way to reinforce the city. On July 14, he launched a daring strike. Using a makeshift fleet of smaller, faster boats, he attacked the Ottoman navy head-on. In a brutal 5-hour battle, his fleet destroyed the blockade, sinking several galleys and capturing dozens of vessels. Belgrade's lifeline was open again. Reinforcements and supplies poured into the fortress, giving the defenders a crucial boost in morale. But Mehmed was undeterred. The fleet was secondary. His true power lay in his cannons and janissaries. The bombardment grew heavier, and soon the walls were shattered in multiple places. On July 21, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Under cover of night, the janissaries stormed through the breaches. They captured the lower town, and savage fighting broke out in the streets. Step by step, the defenders were pushed back toward the upper fortress. It seemed the end had come. A Turkish soldier planted the Sultan's banner on a bastion, a symbol that the city was falling. But in that chaos, Hunyadi made a brilliant move. He ordered his men to pile flammable materials in the narrow streets and set them alight. A wall of fire erupted, trapping the janissaries who had already broken through and cutting them off from reinforcements. Surrounded and isolated, they were forced into a desperate fight. The defenders battled with unmatched fury. In one legendary act of heroism, a soldier named Titus Dugovic grabbed the enemy who had raised the Ottoman standard and hurled both himself and the Turk off the wall, preventing the flag from demoralizing the defenders. The assault collapsed. By dawn on July 22, the Ottomans had been driven back with horrific losses. The fortress had held, but just barely. Hunyadi ordered strict discipline. No one was to leave the walls. They had to repair the defenses and brace for the next attack. But what happened next was something no general could have planned. A few of Capistrano's Crusaders began slipping out of the fortress to harass the Ottomans. The Ottoman cavalry tried to chase them off, but the peasants, armed with farm tools and blind faith, refused to retreat. More Crusaders rushed to join them, then more still. What began as a small skirmish spiraled into a massive, unauthorized charge. At first, Capistrano tried to call them back. But seeing their unstoppable zeal, he ran to the front, raising a crucifix high into the air and shouting, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the end." He led the charge himself. From the fortress walls, Hunyadi was horrified. His entire strategy was unraveling. Yet as he watched, he realized something incredible: the chaotic assault was throwing the Ottoman lines into confusion. This was the moment. He could not let it go to waste. Seizing the opportunity, Hunyadi unleashed his knights. His heavy cavalry thundered out of the fortress in a perfectly timed charge, slamming into the Ottoman flank and driving toward the cannons. The Ottomans were caught off guard. In front of them surged an unstoppable wave of peasants led by a priest, while from the side came Europe's finest cavalry. The Crusaders stormed the Ottoman camp. Hunyadi's knights seized the massive siege guns and turned them on their former masters, blasting into the Sultan's own bodyguard. The invincible army fell into chaos. Panic spread, and soldiers fled. Even Sultan Mehmed II, fighting desperately to rally his men, was struck in the thigh and wounded. The conqueror who had broken Constantinople had been defeated. His army was routed. Belgrade was saved. Under the cover of night, the shattered remains of the Ottoman army fled in haste, abandoning their camp and even their mighty cannons. When the Sultan regained consciousness and learned the full scale of the disaster, he was said to have nearly taken his own life. The victory at Belgrade was complete, a stunning military upset of unimaginable scale. But triumph came at a terrible cost. In the days that followed, as thousands of corpses lay rotting under the summer sun, plague swept through the Hungarian camp. The disease struck down the very men whose courage had won the battle. John Hunyadi, the brilliant general who had masterminded the defense, died just 3 weeks after his great victory. A few months later, John of Capistrano, the fiery priest whose faith had inspired a crusade, also passed away. Neither man lived to see the peace they had secured. Yet their legacy endured. The astonishing victory at Belgrade stopped the Ottoman advance into Hungary for the next 70 years. It stabilized the frontiers of Christendom and became a beacon of hope across Europe, showing the world that even the great conqueror was not invincible. In Rome, the news was met with overwhelming joy. Before the battle, Pope Calixtus III had ordered the bells of every church in Europe to ring at noon each day, calling the faithful to pray for Belgrade's defenders. When word of victory arrived, the noon bell transformed from a cry for help into a celebration of triumph. That tradition still lives on. To this day, in many Catholic and Protestant churches, the noon bell is a direct echo of that desperate, glorious summer of 1456. More than 500 years later, it continues to remind us of how a seasoned general, a fiery priest, and an army of ordinary farmers stood together in faith and courage, defied an empire, and achieved one of the greatest military upsets in all of history. The Siege of Belgrade remains a timeless lesson: leadership, faith, and the courage of ordinary people can turn the tide against impossible odds. History is not always written by the largest armies, but often by the strongest hearts. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about the incredible battles that shaped our world, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what moment of history you'd like us to cover next.